Hi, I'm Corey Yoder and I'm here with Fat Quarter Shop. We're going to be talking about piped binding, actually faux piped binding because we're not actually making piping ahead of time. This is a really fun way to machine bind, and it was actually the first way I was able to complete machine binding that I was happy with my machine binding. I don't know if you guys are like me, but I tried all kinds of machine binding with the glue, without the glue, with I mean, you name it. I feel like there is a tutorial for machine binding just about any way. So this was the first way I was happy with it. So I want to share it with you because it is a fun way. It takes a little bit longer to prepare your binding, but if you can end up with a binding that you're happy with on the front and on the back, then we are in good shape. So what we're going to need, we need two different fabrics. I'm gonna hold this up for you. So this is the piped binding here. And as you can see, we have a little gray piping, and then we have the what looks like regular binding around the outside edge. So we're actually going to be sewing both of those two fabrics together. What you're going to need for the wider binding fabric, this is cut at 1.5 inches, and for the gray that you see here, this is cut at 1 3/4. So it feels a little bit counterintuitive that your binding you're cutting wider is actually going to be for the piping, but that's exactly what you need to do. So I have 3 strips here of my little red print cut at 1 1/2, and I have 3 strips of my gray cut at 1 3/4. The first thing that I like to do, and this is just purely my personal preference, is I like to take either one of the red ones or one of the gray ones and cut it in half. And the reason I like to do that is so that we don't have all of our seams lining up from the red fabric and the gray fabric. I don't like to have my seams butted up on that binding strip when we're joining the two colors. So I cut one of my strips in half so that I can avoid that. It just takes away some of the bulk, and it doesn't have to be exactly in half. I'm just gonna kind of go by that seam that I have there, and I'm just gonna cut it in half here. And you don't have to do this. This is just a little quirk that I like to do so that I don't have to fuss with double seams in my binding. So once you have these strips cut, we're actually ready to go over to the machine, and we are going to join each of the 2 different colors. So I'm gonna join all my red strips together, and I'm gonna join all of my gray strips together before we sew the 2 colors together. So let's go do that. I am going to go ahead and I'm going to join my little red strips first. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to make sure I alternate my shorter strips with my longer ones. So I'm going to start with a short one, and then I'm going to grab one of my longer ones. And I'm just joining these the same way that you would regular binding when you're making binding. I join mine on a diagonal. So I have my 2 strips together here. I'm using my Clearly Perfect Angles seam guide. So I'm not drawing lines, I'm just going to use that for my diagonal. Line up my point up here with my needle, line up my back point with that center line, and we're just going to sew those together. I'm going to shorten my stitch length just a little bit. It's at about a 2. I jump around a lot from piecing to binding to machine quilting, and depending on what I'm working on, I have different settings. So if you notice that you're working on something and you need to adjust your stitch length, you can do that. This is a long one, so I'm gonna sew a short one here. And when I am doing these, I just leave them all hooked together till the end. I don't know if other people do that or not, but I find I just leave them. So I just start feeding that in, I catch that point, and then I make sure that my back point is lined up with this center line here. And I keep going. And then we have one more to attach here. He's going to get attached just the same way. Gonna feed him up in there. Just catch him, double check my back point there. Okay, and then I'm going to do my gray strips, and they get attached just the same way. Now with the gray, I just have the 3 strips because we did not cut one of them in half. I'm lining everything up here. The tip there, I want that to go right at my needle. My back point is nice and tidy lined up there with the center seam, so I'll just sew those together. I use this a lot for these lines, like I've said, but it's also a great way to be able to double check your 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you have trouble with your seam allowance, the center line is right in the center, but then each black line on either side of this guide is a 1/4 inch away from your needle. So you can easily see if you are stitching properly or not if you have trouble with that 1/4 inch seam. I know when I have my daughters sew, I always have this, well, I always have this on my bed, but it's super helpful when I have my girls sewing because then they can easily see. Sometimes, you know, we have trouble and kids have trouble too, and it's a great tool for them as well, just to double check that 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so I have all of my bindings. This is usually what mine end up with, and then I snip them apart. We'll trim off the little ears, press those, and then we will be ready for our next step. I'm back. My binding strips have been sewn together. I did these just the same way I always do my binding. I trimmed away the little extra bit, left about a 1/4 inch seam allowance and pressed to one side. If you prefer to press open, you could also press open for this step. The next thing that we're going to do is take these over to the sewing machine, and we are actually going to be lining everything up and sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance down the whole thing. So let's head over and do that. So we are ready to join together our 2 binding strips. I have the narrower strip on the top so that I can make sure that it's lined up nicely on the right side as well as the left. You want about a 1/4 inch of the gray underneath. And I say that because the more accurate you are with your sewing and pressing of this binding, the happier you're going to be with the end result. So you do want to take your time for this. I have the 1/4 inch foot on, and I'm just going to go fairly slowly and make sure that everything is lined up as I go. It does take longer to prepare this binding than when you're preparing binding for like hand binding, but we do save time in the end because we are doing the whole process by machine. So I go pretty slowly. I found if I tried to go fast, things got a little out of hand, so I backed it off so I can make sure it stays tidy. Tempting to go fast because it's just a straight seam, but the more accurate we are, better off we're gonna be. If you wanted to pin this, you certainly could, or you could use Wonder Clips. Pinning would probably work better than Wonder Clips. I usually just kind of line up as I go. And I just straighten it up as I need to. And there we go. We have everything joined together, and we will go back and I will show you how to press this so that you can have it all set to attach to your project. We have our binding strips sewn together, and now the next thing we need to do is press everything into place. So I have my dark fabric on top, which is the whiter of the 2 fabrics, and I just want to kind of set that seam. Oftentimes I will do this as I go rather than going down the whole thing and then coming back. So I will lay this out the width of my ironing board, and I will set the seam, and then I will just come back through and press it as I go. I have the darker fabric on top because we want to press towards that darker fabric. That's going to give a little bit of extra bulk within that seam, and that's going to just give your faux piping a little bit of body. So you're just going to go down through and iron this whole thing. And then we're going to come back through and we're going to do wrong sides together. Okay. So I'm just going to keep on going. I am just going to go ahead and set this whole thing because it's going to be a little bit faster for me. Now, if you were using a lighter fabric rather than a darker fabric for your piped binding, we would still want to go ahead and press towards the piped binding fabric. I know we're used to pressing towards the dark side. The reason we're pressing towards the piped binding, even if it's a lighter fabric, is because it just adds a little bit of bulk. If you're familiar with regular binding, or regular piping rather, you'll know that it usually, sometimes there's cording inside of it and it usually just has a little bit of body. So by putting this seam allowance towards the piping, we're giving the same illusion that you would have from regular piping. So you'll just go ahead and put your wider fabric on top, set your seam, and then we're going to press towards that piping fabric. Okay. And just like with the sewing, for this step, if you take your time and make sure that your seams aren't going wavy, you're going to end up with a nicer binding. And I prefer to press from the top like you see me doing here. I know some people would rather press a seam like this from the back. I just always feel like I can be more accurate when I do it this way. I even often will do my, it depends a little bit, but even sometimes like sashing or borders, I like to press from the top. It depends a little bit on the project, but I don't know, I just feel like I can keep that nice and tidy doing it this way, rather than when I press from the back, sometimes it seems like my seams get a little bit wavy. Maybe that's just me. Okay. So I have that all pressed, and now we are ready to press it right sides together. So I'm just going to show you kind of what this is going to look like. You're going to see when we press, because our darker fabric was wider, you're going to have that nice little edging. And I actually prefer to come from this side over here. I have a little bit of a tail, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that off. These are going to get cut off later too, so you wouldn't have to do this right now, but I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And then I like to press it like this. So I start on this side and I have my lighter fabric on top this time. And we're just going to press this down and just make sure that you have that top edge nice and tidy as you go. You're going to notice if you get off a little bit, you're going to be able to see that your binding isn't laying as flat as you might like it to. You could pin this if you wanted to. I oftentimes will just line up with one hand and kind of keep the iron down as I go. Just making sure that it stays tidy as you go down through. And you're going to do the whole strip this way. It's just going to press that down into place. You can use starch for this step if it's not quite laying as flat as you'd like it to. I know I've used starch before and been happy. I do like the faultless starch, the heavier starch works really nice for this. And you're just going to go all the way down through, trying to make sure that that stays nice and tidy there for you. And sometimes that gray, because there's a little bit of extra bulk in there, he might be a little bit stubborn trying to get him to lay down. So this step takes a little bit of time too. But you're just going to go down the whole strip just like this, adding starch if you need to, or extra shots of steam. And you can see what we're getting here as we go is just this little piped binding. You'll just do your whole strip that way. I have one that I've completed over here. So this one I actually did it, I starched it as I went, and then I gave it another extra shot of starch after I was done, just to keep it nice and flat. So that is what your piped binding is going to look like. And next we're going to go over to the machine and I will show you how we're going to attach this to our table topper. So now we are going to attach this from the back to our table topper. I have a 1/4 inch foot on my machine. I am going to go ahead and mark my 1/4 inch down here. If you haven't watched my binding tutorial on how I do regular machine binding, not the piped binding, just regular machine binding, you can go check that out. I mentioned marking this 1/4 inch line in that video as well. I like to do this just so I can get my corners accurate. Sometimes I eyeball them, but I can be more accurate if I mark this. So we will go ahead. So I like to backstitch a little bit when I start sewing. We're gonna do that. And we'll come down to the corner just like how you would attach regular binding. This is all gonna feel pretty much the same. As I get to that corner, we're gonna hit that 1/4 inch. I like to backspace there. Backspace. I like to backstitch a little bit there. And then I pivot around and come back from this direction. You'll do your 90-degree angle right up into the corner. You're gonna flip it back down. And then I backstitch up here as well. I know some people don't backstitch right there, but I always just give it a couple extra stitches there. And then keep everything nice and aligned. You probably want to take your time with this as well. Just making sure everything lines up nicely for you. I'm going to go ahead and mark my 1/4 inch here before I get too far into that corner. You also might have noticed I don't have a pretty print on the back of my topper. I had pretty fabric all cut out and ready to use, and then I completely forgot that I needed to use it until after I had all of my hand quilting done. And so I thought, well, you're just gonna have to not be cute on this one. But ideally, you'd have some cute fabric there. Oh, and look at that, I ran out of thread. See, that's what happens too. Look how far back. I mean, we've all been there, right? So you wanna get your new thread. If that happens to you when you're doing binding, that is no big deal. This happens when I'm doing blocks. Sometimes it takes me even longer to catch that has happened. So we're just gonna go ahead and change our thread, and then we're gonna get right back to stitching. All right, so I have fresh bobbin of thread in, and I'm just gonna go back up to where we left off, and I'm just gonna back stitch. Well, I'll forward stitch a couple here. Whenever you put a fresh bobbin in, sometimes if you try to go backwards first, you make your machine a little cranky. So forward stitch first, back stitch a little, and then we're ready to keep going. So if you ever run out of thread while you're stitching down binding, that's no big deal. You just go back to where you started and keep on going. Or go back to where your thread ran out and keep on going. I'm going to remark that 1/4 inch mark that I marked before. It's not falling at exactly the same spot where it had before, so I'm just going to redo that. I can tell that it's further than a 1/4 inch away. So I am going to go ahead and mark that 1/4 inch mark again. I can tell that it's a little bit, the first mark that I marked is a little bit deep, so I'm just going to remark that, and we'll keep going here. That mark is just a 1/4 inch away from my corner. With this piped binding, if you can get your corners nice and tidy, then your piping and your regular binding all run together so nicely. So do take your time on those corners. And we're going to flip up right into that corner, flip back down, and we'll keep on going. This is our last corner here. Oh, I'm gonna take him a little bit further. I couldn't see my line I marked when I was sewing in, and you can see I was a little shy there, so I'm gonna mark a better line. Just so I can make sure that I have this right where I want it. And you just feel free to make adjustments as you're going, just to get a binding that you're happy with. Oops, let's go back and stitch a couple stitches there. You can tell if you're going to be short when you do that first 90-degree turn, flipping it up, if it doesn't go right into your corner, it's too short and you need to take a couple more stitches over. There we go. So you can see how that just goes right into my corner there. Before it was actually probably 1/8 of an inch or so. It doesn't seem like a lot, but you're just going to have nicer looking corners if you have them right at that 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to go a little bit down this side here, and then I will show you how to join these two ends and we'll finish off the attaching from the back. We have attached our binding to the back side of our table topper, and now we need to trim up these ends so that we can attach them and finish attaching to the back. Now, if you watched my previous binding tutorial, I mentioned that whatever size you cut your binding at, for that video I was cutting 2-inch binding, that's how much tail you need to leave when you're trimming. So this binding actually ends up being 2 3/4. When you measure this, it's 2 3/4. So that's the measurement I need to have in my head when I am trimming. So what we're gonna do here is you're just gonna lay this nice and flat here. You're gonna bring your other tail right up against it here and then fold it back. You want that fold to be all nice and flat. And I'm gonna actually mark this one. When I do 2-inch binding, I don't necessarily mark, but for this one, it's going to work out a little bit better if I mark, just because there's a little bit more bulk that we're working with there. And I said 2 3/4. So, this is 2 1/2, 2 3/4 is right here. I'm gonna slide him up. And then the thing that I do is I always back it off just a little bit. So the binding is 2 3/4, I measure over 2 3/4, but then I subtract about 1/4. And that is just so if it shifts at all, which it tends to kind of stretch a little bit as you're sewing, that it's still going to lay nice and flat. So I'm gonna actually bump this over here. So we're looking at 2 1/2. I'm gonna mark that right here. Now is a great time to use your friction marker. As I mentioned with hand quilting, no friction markers on a quilt top is my preference, but for something like this where you're just snipping it right off, friction is going to be a great plan. So I've got that marked, and then we're just going to snip that off, and then we'll be ready to go back over to the machine and join these together. So I am just pinning these binding strips together. I don't often pin, but this one is one that I'm just going to pin into place just so it doesn't shift on me. It's a little bit hard to tell if you're getting these little seams lined up, so I'm just gonna give it a quick pin, and hopefully it's gonna be where I want it to be. Okay, so I've got it joined up here just like I would if I were doing regular binding. I like to join this on the diagonal. You could opt to join this straight if you wanted to. Oh, and I'm gonna change my foot. I have my 1/4-inch foot on here, which has a seam guide on the side, and that doesn't work as well for this step. So I'm just gonna quickly change that. I switch my feet a lot when I go from binding to piecing. So just make a quick switch and we'll be ready to go. All right, so I am going to line up this top point here with my sewing machine needle. I want this bottom point here to be lined up right there with that middle black line, and we're just going to sew these together. Make so he goes that way. You need to adjust that so it goes a little bit better. You just feel free to do that. All right, we've got those sewn together. We're gonna go back over, trim that up, and then finish stitching that down. All right, we are ready to trim up our piped binding. I just took it off of the sewing machine. I'm just gonna trim that. I'm gonna eyeball my 1/4-inch. You can always use a rotary cutter and do this more accurately if you want to. I tend to just eyeball it for this part. And then I'm gonna press this seam open. I would usually press this to the side, but I think I'm gonna do this one open. I think it's going to lay a little bit nicer. Of course, you can press to the side if you want to. I'm just gonna press that open. And then we are going to, I'm gonna flip that around just so you can see how that join is there. You want that piped, the binding part, to be as tidy as you can. Sometimes it's going to come a little bit nicer than other times. This looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with that. If you would find that you weren't happy with the way that looked, you could always, you know, take that seam out and readjust it. It's best to do that before you trim it, which I had looked at mine before I pressed that seam open, so I knew that I was happy with that. I'm gonna go ahead and lay that back down and then just iron this all back into place. And then we'll go back over to the sewing machine and I'm going to just finish sewing this down. All right, so I'm back from my sewing machine. I stitched that last seam on the last side, and now I'm gonna press this just like I did in my previous binding tutorial. You can catch that video on the Fat Quarter Shop YouTube channel, so be sure and check that out. And we're just gonna press this out, pressing from the back. And we're just gonna go around the whole perimeter, give those corners a nice firm press. And repeat on all 4 sides. I went for years without pressing from the back of my project before I realized what a big difference pressing makes before you stitch from the front. Works great for hand binding if you're hand binding, just to press this before you flip it around to stitch, and great for machine binding. Just gives such a nice finish. All right, so we're ready to take this over to the machine. Before we go over there, I want to show you how cool this is going to look. So when you flip this around, you're going to see you get that nice little piped edging, and it just looks so cute. It takes a little bit more time to prepare and sew on, but it is faster than hand binding. So let's go over to the machine and we will start stitching this down. So we are ready to stitch down from the front. I've added some wonder clips. I like to put a clip on before and after where I'm actually going to be starting. I have on just my standard presser foot that comes with my machine. And what we're going to be doing is we are going to be top stitching right in between the binding, the piped binding, and the regular binding. You're going to want to fit it right in here. And if you kind of know how to feel for when your seams are going left and right when you're piecing, you can kind of feel that same thing here, and you want those to kind of butt up. The other way you can see where you're hitting is you want this little seam to land on top of this seam back where you have attached your binding. So I usually kind of just give it one of these little jobbies and see if it falls into place, and it usually lands kind of where I want it to. And then we're going to start stitching. Now, the very first time that I did this sort of binding, I tried using the Elmer's glue, the washable school glue, to kind of tack things into place. And I found that I could be more accurate without using that. But I know a lot of people really do like using the Elmer's glue just to hold things in place. The washable kind is the one that you want. So if that's you and you do machine binding, but you're new to this technique, you might find that you like using the Elmer's glue. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So all I'm using is just the wonder clips to hold my binding in place. And we'll start. I like to back stitch a little bit there, and I go pretty slow here. You want your thread to run right between the gray and the print, and I don't especially care when my stitches go on top of the gray. You can see those a little bit, so I tend to, kind of take my time on this. There's no race. You can put your Netflix back on, or if you have a YouTube channel you like to watch, now is the time to do that. I oftentimes listen to podcasts when I am sewing, so I would usually have some kind of fun podcast going. There always seems to be something new to listen to. And if you can't think of something to listen to or watch, as soon as you ask, you're going to get lots of suggestions. So if you're on any social media and you want to ask for suggestions, people usually have some favorite podcasts or Netflix series that you can binge while you're stitching. That just makes the time go a little bit faster. Or if you have music you like to listen to. I don't think I've ever listened to music while I'm stitching. I'm not a musical stitcher, I guess. I'm just gonna go around all the edges of the quilt. You're attaching just the same way you would regular binding if you do it by machine, but we are just top stitching right in between that, where those two fabrics meet. Now, I'm gonna mark this. I do like marking my edges. My ruler has gotten away from me, so I am going to grab that. All right, so as you come to this corner, you are going to want to stop when you get up here to the seam. You can see your seam from when you sewed on the back side, and that's where you want this seam to end. I like to back stitch there, and then cut and pivot. Okay, so now we want our piping to match up real nice in that corner. If you have to fuss with this a little bit to get it, that's okay. You just take your time. Once you have it where you want it, you could pin if you wanted to. I do tend to use the Wonder Clips, and you just want everything to just be tidy right there in that corner. And then I'm gonna bring another Wonder Clip down here, kind of hold everything in place. And this is one spot where a little dab of Elmer's glue works really well. If you wanted to just put a little dab there, give it a quick hit of heat so it stays exactly where you want it and doesn't budge, this would be a great spot for that, because sometimes this does want to move a little bit. We're gonna see what happens here. A little back stitch. And keep on going down this side here. And you can add a few more Wonder Clips down through here and kind of feel where that needs to be. Grab a couple more. The colorful Wonder Clips are always the fun ones too, because they look so cute as you're working with them. And I always pin mine or use mine from the flat side on top. I don't know if everyone does that. I like the way it holds better when I have the flat side on top. So I am gonna keep going here. I'm gonna finish going around the perimeter. You're gonna keep going just as I've been doing here, taking your time, and then I will finish this up and show you what it looks like. All right, I have my completed table topper. I wanted to show you guys the binding from the back, because people always want to see the back of the machine binding, and really that's kind of where things can go a little bit awry if they're going to. So as you can see, the stitching here is running right around the perimeter, just right inside where the seam of my binding is. You can see how the front looks with that pretty little piped edging, and I think it turned out pretty cute. I hope that you guys try this method if you're new to machine binding. I think it's a great way to start, and be sure to check out my other YouTube videos with Fat Quarter Shop for other techniques and things you might want to try.